I'm not the kind of man who's prone to self-pity, but I'll admit, the emptiness is unbearable. I'd rather lose my mind in the way I remember it once being, full of noise, full of movement, than this quiet descent into nothing. The silence of my house, now, is something that clings to my bones. It started like this. In March 2020, just when the world was plunging into chaos, when the air was thick with fear and the streets were emptying out, I had a moment of clarity that should have been terrifying. I realized I'd been living with a ghost for months, maybe years, and I hadn't even known. Not until it was too late, but let's rewind a bit. To the part of the story where everything still made sense. That I met her when we were 17. Back in 1992. I remember it so clearly, her red lipstick, the long, dark hair falling over her shoulders, the way she laughed at the stupidest things. It wasn't like any other high school crush. It was deep, immediate, something I'd never even thought possible. We started dating, and over the years, everything fell into place. We were young, idealistic, and somehow believed that love was all we needed. We got married at 22, just out of college, and the next 5 years seemed like a dream. A house, a family, a future, all these things I worked so hard to give her. When I think about the early years, it feels like someone else's life. I was a good husband, loyal, faithful, giving. I built us a life from the ground up. I had a career. I didn't just work, I poured everything I had into our future. But no one tells you how long a marriage can feel like a slow burn. How the days stack up, and you forget what it felt like when it was all fire. By the time 2019 rolled around, we'd been married for 23 years. And though we were still together, there was a growing, gnawing sense that something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, until the knee injury, of course. It was October 2019 when I tore my ACL. My life came to a halt. I'd always been active, someone who thrived on movement, martial arts, the gym, running, lifting. Now I was on crutches. I couldn't even climb stairs without feeling like I might collapse. The recovery was slow and painful. 5 months of physical therapy. 5 months of not being the man I was, and that's when it began. What I'd come to know as the beginning of the end. By November, she started staying later at work. I didn't think anything of it at first. Her job had always been demanding. I didn't want to be the nagging husband. I didn't want to make her feel guilty. But then, it became a pattern. I could tell, because her routine was always predictable. At first, she'd stay an hour later, then 2. Soon it was 3 or more. It was the small things that unsettled me, the way she didn't touch me anymore, the way she held her phone close, screen down. The conversations had become shorter, colder. I thought maybe it was the stress of my injury, or the isolation from the pandemic, or maybe even my own resentment bubbling to the surface. But then came the strangest part, her sudden detachment. One evening, in early March, I came home to find her standing in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. I asked her about her day, as I always did, and she snapped at me, sharp, like I was intruding. That was the moment that I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was being pushed out of my own life, and so, by the time March turned into April, the doubts in my mind grew louder. I found myself paying closer attention, obsessing over small things I'd never noticed before. Her moods, her distractions, the way she spoke about her colleagues. Then one night, she came home from work, and I found a text message on her phone. It was innocuous at first glance, but something about it didn't sit right. The words were too familiar, the tone too intimate that I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to tell myself that I was just paranoid, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew. One evening, after she'd stayed out late again, I made a decision. I had to know for sure. So, like a fool, I set a trap that I started an affair that I didn't expect it to go as far as it did, but in a strange way, it was almost a relief to see how easy it was to pull her attention away from me. It was reckless, stupid, and it didn't last long. But the truth was, I wanted her to feel what I was feeling. I wanted her to wonder, even if just for a moment, what it was like to lose everything. That's how I got to the Christmas of 2020. I had planned it carefully. By then, I had my evidence. And while she was celebrating with her family, pretending like everything was fine, I was making my exit. I disappeared, no notice, no warnings, no tears. I became, in a way, like the ninja I had always admired. Invisible, silent, gone without a trace. On Christmas Eve, I left her a gift. It wasn't a fancy box or something wrapped in glittering paper. It was a plain manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers. I watched her read them in shock, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, and just like that, I was gone. She didn't know what to do with herself. She had everything, and then, nothing. I had never felt such power. It was like watching a carefully constructed tower collapse in slow motion. The house that we built together, the life we created, all of it, reduced to rubble. But the real twist came later, when she found out what I'd done. How I had orchestrated my own infidelity just to make her feel what I felt. Just to show her how it felt to be betrayed, abandoned. She never saw it coming, but here's the part no one tells you. It's not about revenge. It's not about who wins or loses. It's about realizing, when it's too late, that you can't unsee the truth. I had to disappear. Because the truth was that the woman I loved, my best friend, my confidant, the person who knew me better than anyone, had become someone else, and that was the hardest part. Because even as she stood there, holding those divorce papers, I knew, I'd never truly been her everything, that I was just a shadow in her world, too. It was strange, that night I left. The weight of the envelope in my hand was more than just the paper, it was everything that had happened, everything that would follow. And I didn't feel the guilt I expected to feel. It wasn't relief, either, more like a muted sense of finality, the kind you get when you finally let go of something you've been holding onto for far too long. That it's a dangerous thing, that sense of finality. You think it's freedom, but it's really just the first step into a deeper kind of prison. That I had planned it carefully, calculated it in ways I hadn't even understood until it was over. There's something intoxicating about seeing the look on someone's face when they realize you've outsmarted them, outwitted them, even when they thought they were the ones with the upper hand. But as I watched her hold those divorce papers in her shaking hands, I realized something else too. I hadn't just left her, I had left myself behind, too. Her reaction was everything I'd anticipated. At first, she just stared at the papers, the lines of text on the form blurring together. Then, she looked at me, this wild, confused look, as if I'd materialized out of thin air. The facade was cracking, the truth was beginning to seep through the cracks. Is this some kind of joke? She asked, her voice trembling. That I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked away. I didn't know then, but I was walking away from everything, not just the house, the marriage, the memories, but the person I had become. And when I closed the door behind me, I closed the door on a version of myself that had been built brick by brick, decade after decade. In that instant, I wasn't a husband or a father or a provider, I was just gone. For a few weeks, it was like I had disappeared completely. I didn't answer her calls. I didn't respond to her texts. I made myself as inaccessible as possible. And every time she called, I felt a strange satisfaction in knowing she was frantic, desperate, trying to piece together a life that no longer existed. I didn't even know where I was staying, some hotel rooms, some rented apartments. I moved from one place to another, floating in a world that no longer had any solid ground beneath it. But as much as I enjoyed the space, the freedom, there were moments of intense loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness you feel when you're in a relationship that's falling apart, but the kind you feel when you're completely unmoored, disconnected from everything you knew. It was like being on the edge of a cliff, the world beneath you crumbling away, and the wind just carrying you. And yet, I didn't miss her. Not in the way I thought I would. The years of trying to fix things, the endless attempts to make her happy, to find that spark we'd once shared, those all seemed so far away. The person I loved had disappeared long before I did. I was just the last to know that I learned things about myself in those weeks of disappearance. I learned that I was more capable than I'd ever thought of letting go. I learned that there was power in silence. And I realized that, while I had been pretending to be the one who was betrayed, I was just as much a part of the deception. Maybe more. The affair, the one I started just to even the scales, I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was undeniable. I had become just as capable of betrayal as she had been. The thought lingered in my mind like a shadow, but I didn't let it surface. I had made my choice. I had taken control. It wasn't until after Christmas that she finally reached out in a way I couldn't ignore. The text was simple: I need to talk. Please. I didn't want to. I didn't need to hear what she had to say. I had no intention of letting her back into my life. But then something inside me shifted, just for a moment, a flash of something like guilt, or maybe curiosity, or maybe just the realization that this had to end, one way or another. So, I agreed. The day we met was cold. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that cut through you even when you were bundled up. We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, one of those places where the tables are too close together, and you can hear the hum of other people's conversations over your own. She was already sitting there when I arrived. She looked older, somehow. We both did. Time had worn us down, I guess, but she looked like she had been caught in a storm. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. The woman who once ruled my world, the woman who held all the keys to our life, was now someone I barely recognized. Why? She asked when I sat down. It was the first time she had spoken since I handed her the papers. There was no pretense, no anger, just exhaustion. I think you know why, I said. She shook her head, a desperate, almost helpless gesture. I don't understand. And that was the moment. The moment I realized, she still didn't understand. She couldn't. Not truly. Because to understand would mean to confront the truth about herself, and she wasn't ready for that. I can't explain it to you, I said. I've tried for years. But you didn't listen. She fell silent, staring at her coffee, the steam rising in thin tendrils. I couldn't tell if she was crying, but I knew she wanted to. She just didn't know how to. I didn't want this, she whispered, looking up at me with those eyes, the same eyes I had fallen in love with all those years ago. I never wanted this. But she did want it. She wanted something I couldn't give her anymore, something I had long stopped being able to give her. I wasn't her love anymore, not in the way I had been. I was just a man she had grown used to. Just a man who had become as invisible to her as she had become to me. I know, I said quietly. But it doesn't change anything. And with that, the door I'd closed months ago was finally shut, locked tight, without any intention of reopening. I paid the bill and walked out of the cafe without looking back. She would have to live with her choices now. Just as I had to live with mine. As for me, I kept moving. Because the man who had once been her husband no longer existed. It's odd, really, how something that feels like an escape can eventually weigh on you like a 1,000-pound anchor. When I left, I thought I was leaving behind my marriage, my old self, all of it. But the truth is, there's no escaping yourself. There's no running from the things you've done, the things you've been. And eventually, you're forced to confront them. No matter how much distance you put between yourself and everything that once was. The months after that meeting in the cafe were a blur. Time moved differently. It felt like it moved faster, then slower, like I was being pushed forward and pulled back at the same time. The first few weeks were a strange kind of freedom. I woke up every day in a different place. Some mornings, I didn't even know where I was. Some nights, I found myself in places I'd never been, surrounded by people I didn't care to know. It wasn't about fun or excitement. It was about distance. From her. From everything, but then it started to change. I didn't notice at first, but I began to drift. The constant moving became exhausting. The faceless faces became less interesting. And I started to miss something I hadn't thought about in years: roots. A home. A sense of permanence. The very things I'd tried so hard to escape, that I had made myself invisible. I had turned myself into a shadow, just like I'd wanted. But shadows don't live, they follow. And I wasn't prepared for how heavy that would feel. It was late summer when I heard from her again. The email was simple. A message with a subject line that read, "Our sons need you." That I hadn't thought about them in weeks, and that, in itself, hit me harder than I expected. I had been so wrapped up in my own destruction that I had forgotten to think about the wreckage I left behind. They were still there. They were still growing up, still needing me in ways I couldn't pretend to ignore. The boys. They weren't just the children I had raised for years, they were the part of me I had abandoned when I made my escape. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who could walk away from his kids, but I had done just that. And I felt it now. A dull ache that stretched deeper than anything I could put into words. The email didn't say much. She didn't need to. I knew what it meant. The boys were struggling, each in their own way. One was acting out at school, the other retreating into himself. They needed their father. And I, like an idiot, had disappeared. That I wasn't sure what to do with this newfound awareness. Was it guilt? Regret? Was it just the awareness that I couldn't keep running from the consequences of my actions forever? I didn't know. What I did know was this: I had to go back. Not for her. Not for us. But for them. That I didn't reach out to her. I didn't want to. But I sent a message to the boys. The first in months. And the feeling that surged through me when I saw their replies, it was nothing like I expected. I thought it would be cold, indifferent. But instead, it was relief. They were still my boys. They still needed me, no matter what I had done, no matter how far I had pushed them away. The next few weeks were a blur of awkwardness and half-repair. I moved back into the house, but it wasn't the same. Nothing could ever be the same. Every room felt like a memory I could no longer trust. Every corner seemed to echo with a history I couldn't ignore. She didn't fight me. She didn't ask for an explanation, didn't demand answers. We simply existed in the same space, two people who had once loved each other, now reduced to strangers. It was almost like she knew, like she had been waiting for me to return, but also dreading it. I could see the weight in her eyes when she looked at me, a kind of resignation, but also something more. Something deeper. It wasn't just that she had betrayed me. It was that she had come to terms with the fact that I had betrayed myself long before I betrayed her. I had let us both get lost. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all. That we talked less and less as the days went by. We spoke only when it was necessary. About the boys. About the house. About the things that no longer mattered to either of us. We existed in a kind of truce, familiar strangers with nothing left to say. But the boys, they made all the difference. When they smiled at me, when they laughed, when they asked me to help with their homework or take them to the park, it was like finding a part of myself I thought I had lost forever. They weren't the same, either. They had grown up in my absence, and though I had returned, the distance between us was something I couldn't just erase. Still, there was hope in that distance. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the damage I had done. But I could be here, now. I could show up. I could do my best to be the father I had always intended to be, and maybe that was enough. That I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened between us. The lies, the betrayals, the decisions that led us here. It all feels like a haze I can't clear away. Maybe there's no understanding it, and maybe that's the real truth I had to accept. But I can't say I'm sorry anymore. I can't say I regret it either. I think, in the end, we all get what we deserve. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. She got what she deserved. I got what I deserved. And the boys, well, they're still too young to understand the full weight of any of this. But they will. And when they do, I can only hope that I've given them something better than the wreckage I've left behind. And as for her, she's still there. Still trying to piece together the life she thought we'd have. I don't know what happens next for her. Or for me. But I do know this: life doesn't give second chances. It only gives you moments. And it's what you do with those moments that defines you. Maybe that's what I've learned. Maybe it's not about getting everything back. It's about being able to face the truth, to stand in the wreckage, and still find something worth saving. For now, that's enough. That I hope it's enough.